All right, Lewis Clark State College history students, Professor Eric Martin here, and let's talk about the setup for Chapter 19 in Worlds of History. We're looking at the scientific revolution, and we're really looking at two questions, maybe three within that. And when I say maybe three, you want to get a sense about what is the scientific revolution in general. Like what was that process? And speaking of processes, the chapter asks you to think about the difference between process as a change and process as a revolution, and whether or not utilizing the term revolution is accurate and or useful in this particular case, because it conveys a certain speed, and the question becomes, historically, did it happen as quickly as a revolution implies? So you want to think about that kind of issue. When is it a change? When is it a process? When is it a revolution? And what does any of that kind of stuff mean? But the other two big questions you want to be thinking about as you do the reading are, is the scientific revolution best understood as a European phenomena, or is it a global phenomena? And in order to do that, you have to get into thinking about science in other parts of the world. So this question about how similar or how different was European science from that practiced elsewhere in the world, and where do some of these European scientific ideas actually come from? That'll help you answer that question. So as you go through all these sources, keep that question in mind. The other question that you need to keep in mind is this issue about what role did women play in the scientific revolution? And we have 2 or 3 documents looking at this particular issue specifically directly. But just because a document doesn't appear to address the subject doesn't mean you can't learn something about it from that document. So keep that in mind. Sometimes the fact that the document doesn't mention women at all might be the information you need to think about what role women played. All right, those are the big questions to think about as you go through the documents. Let's go through a few of the documents, and I'm going to do them out of order because the ones that require more setup are the secondary sources. And I want you to pay attention to these secondary sources. I think the secondary sources in this chapter are pretty interesting. The first secondary source is the very first document by Jack Goldstone, Why Europe? And he's making this argument that in the early part of the early modern period, this is kind of what Chinese science looks like. This is kind of what Indian science looks like. This is kind of what Persian science looks like. This is kind of what European science looks like, and religion and worldview in general. And so his question is, what happens in Europe? What are the conditions in Europe that are different than in these other places, in which we actually have what appears to be a major disruption in the worldview? Why is the worldview of Europeans revolutionized, perhaps, by science in ways that other places in the world don't initially, maybe, depending on how you answer that question, right? But that's what you want to look at. What's happening in Europe at the time? And then take a look at document number 7 by Linda Noreen Schaefer, China, Technology, and Change. Because I like to pair the Goldstone document to the Schaefer document. Because Schaefer would take issue with Goldstone's question. And so she goes through what's happening with technology and science in China and throws some kinks into this issue about why Europe. She doesn't like that question. She doesn't think she thinks it's a loaded question. And so if you can read her document and get an idea about why she would think that question was loaded to begin with, you'll be all right. And then just kind of get an idea what's the technological process that she describes as happening in China, and what kind of indicators of science does she say you can and cannot see in China. Okay. And then you got document number 5 by Anderson and Zisner. This is actually a really interesting piece from an article that really challenges the idea that there was a scientific revolution for women. And so read the article. And why would Anderson and Zisner challenge the idea that there was a scientific revolution for women? It's kind of interesting. All right, so those are the 3 secondary sources, and that kind of forms the theoretical basis for the stuff we're going to do this week. The other documents are more or less straightforward, right? They're primary sources. We've got this piece by Francis Bacon, famous piece. We should read it, get an idea of how he's envisioning the scientific method, how he's envisioning how you go about studying nature, because this is sort of a foundational document. This piece by Lady Mary Wortley Montague is an interesting look at what's going on in Turkey with smallpox inoculation. So you both get the element of what's happening with women, but you also get an element of what's happening in other parts of the world with science. And then you have this piece by Gimpaku, looking at the Japanese interest in Dutch dissection. So check that out. What are the Japanese interested in? And then we've got this piece by Benjamin Franklin, who is looking at an experiment with a hot air balloon in Paris and kind of describing what goes on. So we'll use those primary sources as ways of testing out some of these secondary sources. So take good notes on this stuff as you go. You're going to reuse them for a thought piece. You may reuse them for your first formal essay. That's all I got. We'll see you in class.